Yazoo County, Mississippi, 1991. In the vast, fertile flatlands of the Delta, where the summer sun beats down with the weight of history, a desperate mother and her young daughter sought refuge in a community that promised salvation. It was called The Haven, a place of healing, purpose, and order, run by a man who spoke of light and discipline. But the fences were disguised by sunflowers, and the sanctuary was a cage of quiet control. For 5 years, a brilliant little girl watched as the light in her mother's eyes dimmed, as names were erased, and as people vanished into silence. The world outside had forgotten them, but it never knew that inside the compound, a child's memory was becoming a perfect, unflinching record of the truth, paving the way for an escape that would one day bring an entire hidden world to its knees. Before I begin, thank you for watching. I'd love to know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It means a lot to know you're here, sharing these stories with me. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you the story. The year was 1991, and the world had closed in on Monica Cole. It had not happened with a sudden violent crash, but with a slow, grinding erosion that had worn away every foundation she thought was stable. First, the textile mill in Jackson had shut down, its looms falling silent, taking her steady, reliable job with it. The severance pay had been a pittance, a bandage on a wound that required surgery. Then, the landlord, a man with a ledger for a heart, had served the eviction notice, his sympathy as thin as the worn-out paper it was printed on. Monica, a woman who had always paid her bills on time, who had prided herself on her independence, found herself and her 5-year-old daughter, Zariah, living out of their aging sedan, in the back seat, a fortress of blankets, and the sum total of their worldly possessions. Hope had become a luxury she could no longer afford. It was during this period of profound and terrifying uncertainty that she first heard of The Haven. The flyer had been tacked to a community bulletin board, its message printed in a serene, calming green ink. It spoke of a wellness community nestled deep in the rural heart of the Mississippi Delta, a place for those who felt lost, who sought purpose and a return to a simpler, more meaningful way of life. It promised not charity but clarity, not a handout but a hand up. The words were a balm on Monica's raw and frayed nerves. The leader, a wellness mentor named Samuel Reynard, was described as a man who had dedicated his life to healing the broken pieces of a fractured society. For Monica, whose world had been shattered into 1,000 sharp, unrecognizable fragments, the promise of being made whole again was an irresistible siren song. She made the call, her voice trembling with a mixture of desperation and a fragile, burgeoning hope. The voice on the other end of the line was warm, reassuring, and deeply understanding. Yes, there was a place for her and her daughter. Yes, they would be welcomed. The directions were simple, leading them away from the choked, indifferent arteries of the city and deep into the quiet, green, and seemingly endless expanse of the countryside. The drive itself was a kind of pilgrimage. With every mile that passed, the gray, concrete landscape of her failure gave way to the rich, dark soil and the vibrant, unapologetic green of the Delta. Zariah, quiet and observant in the passenger seat, watched the world go by with a child's solemn, unblinking curiosity. She did not understand the full weight of her mother's anxiety, but she could feel it, a low, constant hum that vibrated through the very frame of the old car. She watched her mother's hands, clenched tightly on the steering wheel, and saw the way her jaw was set in a line of grim determination. Their arrival at The Haven felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The entrance was marked not by a gate, but by a simple, hand-carved wooden sign that read, "The Haven, find your purpose." A long, dusty driveway, lined with rows of impossibly tall and cheerful sunflowers, led them toward a collection of neat, rustic cabins that were clustered around a large, central meeting hall. The air was clean, the silence broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant, happy sound of children's laughter. It was peaceful. It was orderly. It was everything her life was not. And then he appeared. Samuel Reynard emerged from the main hall, a man in his late 50s, his silver hair catching the late afternoon sunday. He was not a physically imposing figure, but he moved with a kind of calm, unhurried grace that commanded attention. His smile was warm, his eyes a pale, piercing blue that seemed to look not just at Monica, but directly into the deepest, most wounded parts of her soul. He did not offer a handshake, but instead placed a gentle, paternal hand on her shoulder. "Monica," he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "Welcome home. The journey is over." In that moment, under the warm, reassuring weight of his hand, hearing her name spoken with such a profound sense of certainty, Monica felt the tight, suffocating knot of fear that had been lodged in her chest for months finally begin to loosen. The tears that she had held back for so long, the tears of failure, of shame, of a deep and abiding loneliness, began to stream down her face. She was not judged, she was not questioned, she was accepted. Reynard listened to her story, his expression one of deep and unwavering empathy. He nodded, his gaze never leaving hers, making her feel as though she were the only person in the world. He spoke of the noise of the outside world, of the false promises of materialism, of the spiritual sickness that had infected a society that had lost its way. He spoke of the haven as a sanctuary, a place where that noise was silenced, where true purpose could be found not in what you owned, but in what you contributed. He offered her not just a roof over her head, but a new life, a new identity, a new and unbreakable sense of belonging. For Zariah, standing silently by her mother's side, the man was a confusing mixture of kindness and something else, something she could not yet name. She watched the way he held her mother's gaze, the way his smile never quite seemed to reach the cold, calculating depths of his eyes. She noticed the other adults who moved about the compound, their faces serene, their movements calm and deliberate, but their eyes held a strange, watchful stillness, a quiet and deeply unsettling absence. She saw the sunflowers that lined the driveway, and for the first time, she realized that they were planted so closely together that they formed a thick, impenetrable wall. The haven was beautiful. It was peaceful. But as the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns, a small, cold flicker of unease, the first faint whisper of a primal alarm, began to stir in the heart of the 5-year-old girl who had just been promised paradise. She did not yet understand that they had not just arrived at a destination. They had been absorbed into a design. The process of induction into the haven began the very next morning, and it was a masterclass in the subtle and deeply insidious art of psychological control. It was presented not as a stripping away of identity, but as a cleansing, a necessary shedding of the old, broken self to make way for the new, purposeful one. The ceremony was held in the main hall, a large circular room with a high vaulted ceiling, the wooden beams exposed like the ribs of a great protective beast. The morning light streamed in through a large, circular window in the ceiling, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air and lending the entire space a serene, almost cathedral-like quality. Samuel Reynard stood in the center of the room, his voice calm and reassuring, as he explained the first and most important step on the path to clarity. "The outside world," he said, his arms spread wide in a gesture of paternal embrace, "burdens us with labels, with documents, with a history that keeps us chained to our past failures. To be truly free, we must release these anchors." He then produced a large, beautifully carved wooden box. This, he explained, was the archive of yesterday. He invited Monica and the other new arrivals to come forward and place their worldly attachments inside for safekeeping. One by one, they stepped forward, their movements hesitant at first, and then, encouraged by the gentle, approving nods of the older members, more certain. Monica opened her worn, cracked purse and removed her driver's license, its plastic-encased image a ghost of a woman she no longer recognized. She added her social security card, Zariah's birth certificate, and the small, tattered bundle of photographs of her own parents, the last physical connection to a life that now felt 1,000,000 miles away. With each item that she placed in the box, she felt a strange and conflicting mixture of profound loss and an even more profound and deeply intoxicating sense of relief. She was letting go. She was being unburdened. Zariah watched, her small hand clutching her mother's as the heavy, ornate lid of the box was closed, the sound of the latch clicking shut echoing in the vast, silent hall with a chilling and deeply symbolic finality. The next step in the cleansing was the renaming. "The names our parents gave us," Reynard explained, his voice taking on a teacher's patient, instructional tone, "are the names of the people we were. But we are no longer those people. Here, at the Haven, we are defined not by our past, but by our purpose, and so we will be given names that reflect that purpose." He walked around the circle, his eyes seeming to peer into the very soul of each new member. He would stop before them, his head tilted in deep and theatrical concentration, before bestowing upon them their new identity. A man who had been a carpenter was now named builder. A woman who had been a teacher was now named scribe. When he came to Monica, he looked at her for a long, silent moment. "You," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "have a deep and abiding strength. You are a foundation upon which others will be built. From this day forward, you will be known as Pillar." Monica wept. The simple, powerful word, a validation of a strength she had long forgotten she possessed. Then, Reynard knelt down to Zariah's level, his face softening into a warm, grandfatherly smile. "And you, little one," he said, gently stroking her hair, "you will work with the earth. You will help to bring forth the bounty that sustains us. You will be known as Tiller." Zariah did not cry. She simply stared back at him, her dark and unnervingly perceptive eyes giving nothing away. The name felt strange in her ears, a costume she was being forced to wear. She was Zariah. She was not Tiller. Life at the Haven was governed by a set of rules that were presented as the principles of clarity. They were designed, Reynard explained, to eliminate distraction, to foster community, and to maintain the delicate and necessary balance of their sanctuary. The most significant of these was the separation of the sexes. Men and women, even married couples, lived in separate cabins. The passions of the flesh, Reynard would preach in the evenings, are a source of chaos, of jealousy, of distraction. To achieve true clarity, the spirit must be elevated above the body. The children, until the age of 10, lived with their mothers, after which the boys would be moved to the men's quarters to learn the disciplines of manhood. The compound itself, which had at first seemed so open and welcoming, began to reveal its true nature to Zariah's watchful eyes. The rows of sunflowers she now saw were not just decorative. They were a living, breathing fence, their thick, tangled stalks forming a nearly impenetrable barrier to the outside world. And the serene, wooden structures that she had thought were garden lookouts were, in fact, watchtowers, always manned by one of Reynard's guardians, a select group of stern, silent men who observed the comings and goings of the community with a quiet and unwavering intensity. The Haven was not a place you could simply leave. It was a place that held you. The illusion of peace was maintained by a constant and pervasive sense of surveillance. Everyone was encouraged to be accountable for their brothers and sisters, to report any murmurings of discontent or any attachments to the past that they might observe. This system of mutual observation turned the entire community into a network of spies, severing the bonds of trust between individuals and ensuring that the only true and safe, the object of their loyalty, was Reynard himself. The quiet, serene smiles on the faces of the other residents now seemed to Zariah to be masks, carefully constructed to hide the deep and abiding fear that was the true and unspoken currency of the Haven. The paradise her mother had so desperately sought had a price, and that price was the complete and total surrender of the self. The rules were not designed to create order, they were designed to create control. And in the heart of this perfectly designed and deceptively beautiful cage, a 5-year-old girl was beginning to learn the profound and dangerous difference between the two. The rhythm of life at the Haven was a slow, monotonous, and deeply exhausting waltz, choreographed to the metronome of Samuel Reynard's will. For Zariah, now known to all as Tiller, the days bled into one another, a seamless and unchanging tapestry of labor and obedience. Her world, which had once been filled with the vibrant, chaotic, and unpredictable colors of a childhood in the city, had now been reduced to the muted, earthy tones of the fields and the stark, sterile white of the communal halls. Her purpose, as Reynard had so benevolently assigned her, was to work. And so, she worked. Her days began before sunrise, the cool, damp air of the Mississippi morning still clinging to the ground. She and the other young children would be roused from their beds in the women's cabin and led to the vast, sprawling fields that were the lifeblood of the community. Her small and still developing hands, which should have been learning to hold a crayon or to turn the pages of a picture book, were instead taught to pull weeds, to sow seeds, to harvest the endless rows of vegetables that were the staple of their bland and repetitive diet. The work was hard, her back aching and her fingers raw by the end of the day. But it was not the physical toll that was the heaviest burden. It was the silence. The children were forbidden to speak while they worked, a rule that Reynard claimed was designed to teach them the discipline of focused intention. But Zariah knew, with a child's deep and intuitive wisdom, that the silence was a tool, a way to keep them from forming friendships, from sharing secrets, from forging the bonds of solidarity that are the natural and most powerful defense of the oppressed. When she was not in the fields, she was assigned to the cleaning crews. She would scrub the floors of the main meeting hall, her small body moving back and forth in a slow, hypnotic rhythm, erasing the footprints of the day's activities. She would polish the wooden benches until they shone, her own, small and serious, face reflected in their dark and lustrous surface. She learned to be invisible, to move through the communal spaces without being noticed, a small, silent ghost in the machine of the haven's daily operations. And in her invisibility, she found a strange and powerful kind of freedom. For it is the one who is not seen who sees everything. She saw the subtle and deeply revealing hierarchies of the community. She saw the way that Reynard's inner circle, the guardians and the scribes, were given better food and warmer clothes, and were exempt from the most grueling of the manual labor. She saw the way they moved with an air of quiet and deeply ingrained superiority, their loyalty to Reynard rewarded with the small and pathetic trappings of power. She saw the fear in the eyes of the other members when a guardian would approach, the way their smiles would become a little too bright, their posture a little too deferential. The communal cabins, which Reynard had described as a way to foster a family of the spirit, were, in reality, instruments of control. The lack of privacy was absolute. Every word, every sigh, every whispered conversation in the dead of night was subject to being overheard and reported. The forced separation of families was the most brutal and most effective of these tools. Zariah would see the men, including the fathers and husbands of the women in her cabin, only during the evening sermons, their faces, across the vast, sterile expanse of the main hall, seeming distant and unfamiliar, like strangers. The natural and most fundamental bonds of human connection were being systematically and deliberately severed, leaving each individual isolated and utterly dependent on the one and only source of authority and affection in their world, Samuel Reynard. Zariah's own relationship with her mother, once the warm and unshakable center of her universe, began to fray. Monica, now Pillar, was assigned to the laundry, a place of endless, back-breaking labor, washing the clothes of the entire community by hand in large, industrial-sized tubs. She would return to the cabin late in the evening, her hands red and raw, her face a pale drawn mask of pure and unadulterated exhaustion. The light that had once danced in her eyes, the light of a fierce and protective love for her daughter, was dimming, replaced by the dull and vacant stare of a true believer. She would speak to Zariah in the new and carefully constructed language of the haven, her words echoing the slogans and platitudes of Reynard's sermons. When Zariah would complain of being tired, Monica would gently admonish her, saying, "Labor is a gift, Tiller. It is the path to clarity." when Zariah would whisper that she missed their old life, that she missed the simple, and now impossibly precious, memory of a hot dog from a street vendor in Jackson, Monica would look at her with a kind of sad and deeply pitying disapproval. "The past is a shadow, my love," she would say, her voice a hollow and recited echo of Reynard's. "We must not look back. The only light is the light that is before us." Zariah learned to stop sharing her true feelings with her mother. She learned that her mother was no longer a safe harbor, that she too had become a part of the system of surveillance, her love for her daughter now secondary to her devotion to her leader. This was the most painful and most profound of all her losses. She was an island, a solitary and deeply lonely observer in a world that was designed to crush the very spirit of individuality. Her burden was not just the work of her hands, it was the work of her mind, the secret and deeply dangerous task of remembering who she was, of holding on to the small and fading embers of her true identity in a world that was determined to extinguish them forever. The child was gone, and in her place, a silent and deeply resilient witness was being forged. The slow and methodical erosion of Monica Cole's spirit was a testament to the chilling and deeply effective power of Samuel Reynard's design. He understood, with a predator's intuitive cunning, that the quickest way to control a person was not through overt physical violence, but through the slow, grinding, and relentless application of exhaustion and isolation. Monica, who had arrived at the haven as a woman of fierce, if wounded, pride, was being systematically and deliberately broken down, her will to resist worn away like a soft stone in a fast-moving and unforgiving river. Her days in the laundry were a form of sensory deprivation. The air was thick with the smell of lye soap and the damp, cloying scent of other people's sweat, a constant and deeply unpleasant reminder of the communal and deeply impersonal nature of her existence. Her world was a landscape of gray, concrete floors and vast, steaming tubs of water. Her work a repetitive and mind-numbing cycle of scrubbing, rinsing, and wringing. There were no clocks in the laundry, a deliberate choice designed to detach the workers from the outside world's arbitrary, and to Reynard, meaningless, measurements of time. The only markers of the day's passage were the rising and setting of the sun, visible only as a faint and distant shift in the quality of the light that filtered in through the high, dirt-streaked windows. The lack of rest was a crucial component of this process. The community's day began before dawn and ended long after dusk, a schedule that left little time for anything other than work, meals, and the mandatory evening sermons. There were no weekends, no holidays, no moments of personal and unscheduled respite. This state of perpetual, low-grade exhaustion had a profound and deeply corrosive effect on the mind. It dulled the critical faculties, making it difficult to question, to analyze, to entertain the kind of complex and dissident thoughts that are the seeds of rebellion. It made the simple and easy answers that Reynard provided in his sermons all the more appealing, his words a kind of soothing and deeply welcome opiate for a mind that was too tired to think for itself. The most insidious and most effective tool of her subjugation was the control of communication. The absolute and total isolation from the outside world was the cornerstone of Reynard's power. He was the sole arbiter of reality, the only source of information about the world beyond their sunflower-lined fences. He would, on occasion, share carefully selected and heavily edited news from the outside, stories of crime, of war, of economic collapse, all designed to reinforce the idea that the world they had left behind was a dangerous and chaotic hellscape, and that the haven was the only and last bastion of safety and sanity. The pretense of a connection to that world was maintained through the community mailbox. Once a month, the residents were allowed to write letters to their families. It was a ritual that was presented as an act of compassion, a way for them to reassure their loved ones that they were well. But it was a cruel and deeply cynical performance. Zariah would watch as her mother would sit at the communal table in the evening, her brow furrowed in concentration as she carefully and lovingly crafted a letter to her own elderly mother, Zariah's grandmother. She would write of the peace she had found, of the beauty of the countryside, of the kindness of the community. She would write of Zariah, of how she was growing strong and healthy, of how she was learning the value of hard work. Her words were a carefully constructed fiction, a mixture of the things she so desperately wanted to believe were true and the things she knew would be approved by the ever-watchful eyes of the scribes who would be reading her letter. She would never write of her exhaustion, of her loneliness, of the small and persistent ache in her heart for the life she had lost. To do so would be an act of ingratitude, a spiritual failing that would be met with disapproval, with public shaming, with a period of corrective and deeply humiliating isolation. After the letters were written, they were placed, unsealed, in a large wooden box. They were then taken to be inspected by Reynard's inner circle. Zariah, in her role as a silent and invisible cleaner, had once seen the scribes at their work. She had seen them reading the letters, their faces impassive, their red pens moving across the pages, striking out words, sentences, entire paragraphs that were deemed inappropriate. She had seen them tossing the majority of the letters into a large canvas bag, a bag that she knew, with a cold and sickening certainty, was not destined for the post office, but for the incinerator. Her mother's words of love, of reassurance, of a desperate and unspoken plea to be remembered, were turning to ash, a secret and deeply tragic sacrifice on the altar of Reynard's absolute control. The light in Monica's eyes, the fierce and intelligent spark that had been the hallmark of her personality, was being extinguished, not by a single violent blow, but by 1,000 small and almost imperceptible acts of spiritual and psychological attrition. She was becoming a ghost in her own life, her movements slow and automatic, her voice a hollow echo of a woman who was no longer there. Zariah, watching this slow and heartbreaking fade, felt a new and deeply terrifying kind of loneliness. She was losing her mother, not to death, but to a kind of living emptiness, a void that was being created and then filled by the will of another man. The love was still there, she knew, buried deep beneath the layers of exhaustion and indoctrination. But it was a love she could no longer reach, a faint and distant star in a sky that was growing darker with every passing day. The nightly sermons were the central and most important ritual of life at the Haven. They were the moments when the community, exhausted from a long day of labor, would gather in the main hall to have their spiritual batteries recharged, their doubts assuaged, and their loyalty to their leader reaffirmed. For Samuel Reynard, it was pure theater, the time when he, the charismatic and all-knowing patriarch, would take center stage. His words, the invisible and unbreakable threads that wove the disparate and increasingly isolated members of his flock into a single and unified tapestry of belief. The hall would be dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a series of candles that cast a warm, flickering, and deeply intimate glow on the faces of the assembled. The members would sit on the hard, wooden benches, their bodies tired, their minds open and deeply receptive to the message that was about to be delivered. Reynard would stand before them, his posture relaxed, his voice a low and mesmerizing cadence that was part prayer, part lullaby. His sermons were a masterful blend of New Age spirituality, self-help jargon, and a subtle and deeply manipulative form of psychological conditioning. He spoke of discipline and light, a phrase that was repeated so often that it became a kind of mantra, a mental shorthand for the core tenets of his philosophy. The light, he explained, was the state of pure and unburdened clarity that could only be achieved by surrendering the ego, by letting go of the selfish and destructive desires of the individual. The discipline was the path to that light, a path of hard work, of obedience, of a complete and total submission to the will of the community. A will that was, of course, personified by Reynard himself. He was a skilled storyteller, weaving parables and allegories that were designed to illustrate his points. He would speak of the weeds of doubt that could choke the garden of the soul, of the storms of passion that could lead the ship of the spirit astray. His language was deliberately vague and deeply metaphorical, allowing each listener to project their own personal struggles onto his universal and easily digestible framework. He made them feel seen, understood, and deeply and personally cared for. But beneath the warm and comforting surface of his words, there was a cold, hard, and deeply unforgiving undercurrent of control. The sermons were also the time for public and deeply humiliating correction. If a member had been reported for an infraction, a moment of anger, a whispered complaint, an expression of longing for their past life, Reynard would not name them directly. Instead, he would craft a sermon around their specific and secret transgression. He would speak of the poison of negativity, of the sickness of ingratitude. His eyes scanning the crowd, his gaze lingering for a moment on the face of the guilty party. The entire community would know who he was talking about, and the silent, collective judgment of the group was a far more powerful and more terrifying punishment than any physical blow. For those whose transgressions were deemed more serious, there were the meditation huts. These were small, windowless, and soundproofed structures located at the far edge of the compound. A member who was sentenced to a period of meditation would be placed inside, with only a small ration of water and a thin blanket. It was a punishment of pure and absolute sensory deprivation, a way of breaking down the last and most stubborn vestiges of individual resistance. A person would emerge from the hut after a few days not angry, but broken, their eyes vacant, their spirit seemingly crushed, their gratitude for being allowed back into the fold of the community a palpable and deeply pathetic thing. It was in this atmosphere of quiet and pervasive fear that Zoraya began her secret and deeply dangerous work of observation and documentation. She had found a small, spiral-bound notebook and a stub of a pencil in a box of discarded items, and it had become her most precious and most secret possession. At night, in the dark and crowded confines of the women's cabin, while the other residents slept the deep and dreamless sleep of the exhausted, Zoraya would write. She did not write a diary of her feelings. Her notes were not emotional, they were clinical. They were the field notes of a small and budding anthropologist, studying a strange and deeply dysfunctional tribe. She would sketch the faces of the community members from memory, her pencil moving silently across the page. Beside each face, she would write their purpose name, and if she could remember it, the name they had come with from the outside world. She was creating an archive of the forgotten, a record of the identities that Reynard was so determined to erase. She documented the rules, the unwritten and ever-shifting social codes of the Haven. She noted who was in favor with Reynard and who was not. She made a list of the words and phrases that were used in the sermons, a glossary of the language of control, and most importantly, she began to keep a record of the disappearances. It would happen quietly, without announcement or explanation. One day, a person would be there, a familiar, if distant, presence in the fields or the dining hall, and the next, they would be gone. When a child would ask where they went, they would be told that the person had completed their journey, that they had found their ultimate clarity, and had been called to a higher purpose. The adults never asked. They knew better. Zoraya, however, did not accept the silence. In her notebook, she would draw the face of the person who had vanished. Beside it, she would write their name and the date she had last seen them. Her small and secret book was becoming a ledger of the lost, a testament to the lives that were being quietly and systematically erased. It was an act of pure and profound defiance. In a world that demanded she forget, she chose to remember. In a world that demanded she be silent, she chose to bear witness. She did not know what she would do with this information. She did not know if it would ever matter. But in the deep and suffocating darkness of the Haven, the simple and powerful act of writing it all down was its own, small and deeply resilient, form of light. The summer of 1996 was a season of oppressive and suffocating heat in the Mississippi Delta. The air was a thick, wet, and heavy blanket, and the sun was a relentless and unforgiving tyrant in a pale and washed-out sky. The days at the Haven were a slow and grueling ordeal, the work in the fields made all the more punishing by the brutal and unceasing humidity. The nights brought little relief, the air in the crowded and poorly ventilated cabins growing thick and stale, making sleep a fitful and deeply unsatisfying affair. There was a tension in the air that was more than just meteorological. A kind of spiritual and emotional listlessness had settled over the community, the relentless heat and punishing labor seeming to drain the last and most stubborn reserves of their energy. Even Samuel Reynard's nightly sermons, which were usually a source of comfort and rejuvenation, seemed to fall flat, his words absorbed by the thick and lethargic atmosphere. And then, one afternoon in late August, the world began to change. A strange and ominous stillness descended upon the compound. The cicadas, whose shrill and constant buzzing was the ever-present soundtrack of the Delta summer, fell silent. The air, which had been so heavy and stagnant, began to stir, a cool and unfamiliar breeze whispering through the thick and drooping leaves of the sunflowers. The sky in the west, which had been a pale and featureless blue, began to curdle, darkening into a bruised and sickly shade of yellow-green. A low and almost imperceptible rumble, more of a vibration in the chest than a sound in the ears, began to emanate from the horizon. The older members of the community, those who had grown up with the volatile and often violent temperament of the Delta weather, knew what was coming. They began to move with a quiet and unaccustomed urgency, securing loose items, shuttering the windows of the cabins, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and a kind of grim and deeply ingrained resignation. This was not going to be a gentle summer rain. This was going to be a storm, a classic and deeply elemental Delta thunderstorm, a force of nature that was as powerful, as unpredictable, and as utterly indifferent to the will of men as the great, muddy river that had carved the very landscape they stood upon. For Reynard, the storm was an unwelcome and deeply challenging intrusion. His entire system of control was built upon the idea of order, of predictability, of the absolute and unwavering authority of his own, carefully constructed reality. A force as chaotic, as uncontrollable, and as profoundly and terrifyingly powerful as a major storm was a direct threat to that authority. It was a reminder that there were powers in the universe that were far greater than his own, a truth that he worked so hard and so relentlessly to make his followers forget. As the first fat drops of rain began to fall, he gathered the community in the main hall. He stood before them, his face a calm and reassuring mask, his voice a steady and unwavering beacon in the face of the approaching chaos. He spoke of the storm not as a threat, but as a test, a cleansing fire that would burn away their fear and purify their spirits. He framed it as an opportunity to demonstrate their faith, to huddle together in the warm and protective embrace of the community, and to trust in his guidance to see them through the darkness. But as the storm hit, its full and terrifying fury unleashed upon the small and isolated compound, even his calm and carefully constructed facade began to crack. The rain came down in a solid and deafening sheet, hammering against the tin roof of the hall with the sound of 1,000 frantic and angry drummers. The wind howled, a high and mournful shriek that made the very foundations of the building groan and tremble. And the lightning, it was a constant and blinding fusillade, each flash illuminating the terrified and upturned faces of his followers in a stark and ghostly white light, followed by a clap of thunder so loud, so violent, that it shook the very air in their lungs. The storm was not just outside, it was inside. The carefully maintained and deeply fragile sense of order that was the bedrock of the Haven was beginning to crumble. The children were crying, their wails of terror a discordant and deeply human counterpoint to Reynard's calm and increasingly strained reassurances. The adults, their faces pale and their eyes wide with a primal and deeply instinctual fear, were beginning to murmur amongst themselves, their carefully constructed and deeply conditioned serenity shattered by the raw and uncontrollable power of the natural world. And then, the lights went out. A bolt of lightning, a brilliant and blindingly white spear of pure and elemental energy, struck a transformer somewhere on the property, and the hall was plunged into absolute and terrifying darkness. A collective gasp, a sound of pure and unadulterated panic, went up from the crowd. In that moment of complete and total blackness, Reynard's control was broken. He was no longer the all-powerful and all-knowing leader, the master of their reality. He was just another man in a dark room, his voice, when he tried to speak, to reassure them, now small and tinny and utterly powerless against the deafening and deeply terrifying the roar of the storm. The chaos he had so long held at bay had finally and irrevocably breached the walls of his carefully constructed kingdom. The world was being turned upside down, and in the heart of that chaos, a 9-year-old girl, who had been waiting for 5 long years for a crack in the perfect and suffocating facade of her prison, felt the first and most powerful stirring of an opportunity she had long since given up on. The storm was not a test. It was a chance. In the black and chaotic confines of the main hall, Zariah Cole was a small and preternaturally calm island in a sea of rising panic. While the other children sobbed and the adults huddled together, their murmurs of fear now rising to a near wail, Zariah's mind was a whirl of cold and incredibly focused calculation. The darkness, which was a source of terror for everyone else, was, for her, a cloak. The deafening roar of the storm, which was a sound of pure and elemental fury to the others, was, to her, a symphony of distraction. This was not chaos. This was cover. She had been sitting near the back of the hall, a position she always chose, a position that allowed her to observe without being observed. When the lights had gone out, she had felt a jolt, not of fear, but of a pure and electric adrenaline. She knew, with a certainty that was as deep and as profound as the marrow in her bones, that this was it. This was the moment the universe had given her. It would not come again. Her mother, Monica, was somewhere near the front of the hall, close to Reynard. Her face, Zariah knew, turned toward him. Her faith, even in this moment of terror, still fixed on the man she believed to be her savior. There was no time to go to her, no time to try and convince her. The years of indoctrination had built a wall between them that was as solid and as impenetrable as the physical walls of the hall. Zariah knew, with a heartbreaking and deeply adult finality, that if she were to escape, she would have to do it alone. She began to move, her small and nimble body slipping silently from the bench. She crawled on her hands and knees, the floorboards cold and rough beneath her palms, her movements masked by the shuffling and panicked movements of the people around her. She was a ghost, a small and determined shadow navigating a world that had been rendered blind. She made her way to the rear entrance of the hall, her hands finding the familiar and reassuring texture of the heavy wooden door. She felt for the latch, her fingers closing around the cold and familiar metal. She lifted it, the sound of the click lost in a deafening clap of thunder. She pulled the door open just enough to slip through, and then she was outside, in the wild and beautiful and deeply, profoundly liberating chaos of the storm. The force of the wind and the rain almost knocked her off her feet. The world was a maelstrom of flying leaves and driving rain, and a darkness that was broken only by the frequent and terrifyingly close flashes of lightning. But she did not hesitate. She had a plan, a map that had been etched into her memory over 5 long years of silent and meticulous observation. She knew the layout of the compound better than anyone, every building, every path, every tree, every flaw in its design. And she knew exactly where she was going. She ran, her bare feet slipping and sliding in the thick and rapidly accumulating mud. She ran not toward the main gate, which she knew would be guarded, but toward the fields, toward the far and western edge of the property, the place that was the most remote and the least watched. It was here, she knew, that the fence of sunflowers was the weakest, its foundations compromised by a small and often overflowing creek that ran along the property line. The flash flood, which had been the catalyst for the power outage, had been her unwitting accomplice. As she neared the edge of the fields, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene before her, and a small and triumphant cry escaped her lips. The creek had become a raging, muddy torrent, and its powerful current had done what she had only ever dreamed of. It had torn a section of the sunflower fence completely from its moorings, creating a wide and beautiful and utterly unguarded opening. The gate was open. She scrambled down the muddy bank of the creek and plunged into the cold and fast-moving water. The current was strong, and for a terrifying moment, it threatened to pull her under, to drag her away. But she was a child of the Delta. Her small and wiry body possessed of a surprising and deeply resilient strength. She fought against the current, her arms and legs pumping, her teeth gritted in a snarl of pure and unadulterated determination. She pulled herself up the opposite bank, her clothes soaked, her body covered in a thick and cold layer of mud, and she was free. She did not look back. To look back was to risk seeing a light, hearing a shout, to risk having her resolve falter. She fixed her eyes on the darkness ahead, and she ran. She ran with a strength born of 5 years of repressed and righteous anger. She ran for her mother, for the woman she had lost. She ran for the other children, for the faces in her notebook. She ran for the small and 5-year-old girl who had arrived at this place full of a child's hope, and for the 9-year-old and deeply, profoundly old woman who was now leaving it. The storm raged around her, its fury a perfect and welcome mirror of the fury in her own, small and fiercely beating heart. She was no longer Tiller, the silent and obedient worker of the fields. She was Zariah Cole, and she was running for her life. The night was an endless and terrifying blur of mud and rain, and a darkness so absolute that it seemed to have a physical weight. Zariah ran until her lungs burned, until her legs were a weak and trembling mess beneath her, until the adrenaline that had propelled her from the compound had been completely and utterly exhausted. She had no sense of time, no sense of direction. Her world had been reduced to the simple and primal act of putting one foot in front of the other, of moving forward, away from the place that had been her prison for nearly half her life. She stumbled and fell, the thick and unforgiving Mississippi mud sucking at her bare feet, her small body crashing into the wet and unforgiving ground. But each time she fell, she would pull herself back up, a small, ragged, and defiant sound tearing its way from her throat. She was driven by a single and powerful image, the face of her mother, sitting in the darkness of the main hall, her faith still fixed on the man who had stolen her life. That image was a fire in her belly, a force that was more powerful than her fear, more powerful than her exhaustion. Sometime in the deep and impossibly long hours of the night, the storm began to recede. The rain softened from a hard and driving sheet to a steady and persistent drizzle. The thunder, which had been a constant and deafening cannonade, now became a low and distant grumble, the sound of a beast retreating to its lair. A pale and watery light began to seep into the eastern sky, the first and most welcome hint of a dawn she had not been sure she would live to see. It was in this gray and pre-dawn light that she finally saw it. A road, a thin black ribbon of asphalt, a straight and solid line of human intention in a world of wild and chaotic nature. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She scrambled up a small grassy embankment and collapsed onto the hard and blessedly solid surface of the road, her small body finally and completely giving out. She lay there, a small and pathetic bundle of mud and rags, as the world slowly and groggily came back to life. She heard the sound of an engine, a low and powerful rumble that grew steadily louder. A pair of bright and blinding headlights cut through the morning mist, and a large 18-wheeler truck slowed to a stop beside her. The driver, a man named Henderson, on his long and lonely haul to Memphis, peered out of his window, his heart giving a sudden and sharp jolt of a mixture of fear and a deep and very human curiosity. He saw what he, at first, thought was just a pile of discarded muddy rags. But then, the rags moved. He climbed down from his cab, the rain instantly soaking him, and approached the small and trembling figure on the road. And then he saw her. He saw not a pile of rags, but a child, a little girl, her face streaked with mud and tears, her eyes wide with a deep and bottomless well of a trauma he could not even begin to comprehend. He wrapped her in a thick, dry blanket from his cab, and he called the police, his voice a panicked and disbelieving shout over the sound of his own idling engine. The Yazoo County Sheriff's Department was a sleepy and typically quiet place in the early hours of the morning, but the arrival of the small and silent girl in the mud-caked blanket sent a jolt of a strange and unfamiliar energy through the station. The deputies, accustomed to dealing with minor traffic violations and the occasional and predictable domestic dispute, were at a loss. They did not know what to make of the ghost who had appeared on their doorstep. The girl would not speak. She sat on a chair in the corner of the office, the blanket wrapped tightly around her, her small body trembling uncontrollably. She would not tell them her name. She would not tell them where she had come from. She simply stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on some distant and horrifying point that only she could see. A young and newly promoted deputy named Clara Dunham was on duty that morning. She was a woman who had chosen a career in law enforcement, not out of a desire for power, but out of a deep and abiding sense of a duty to protect the vulnerable. She saw the other deputies, their attempts to question the girl clumsy and loud and deeply and unhelpfully masculine. She approached the child not as a police officer, but as a woman. She knelt down in front of the girl, so that they were at eye level. She did not ask questions. She simply sat there, in the silence, her presence calm and patient, and deeply and profoundly reassuring. She offered the girl a cup of hot chocolate, its sweet and warm scent filling the sterile and unwelcoming air of the office. Zariah looked at the woman, and for the first time, she saw not a uniform but a person. She saw a kindness in the woman's eyes, a genuine and unforced empathy that was a world away from the calculated and manipulative kindness of Samuel Reynard. She took the cup, her small and trembling hands wrapping around its warmth. She took a sip, the sweet and chocolatey liquid a shocking and deeply, profoundly welcome sensation after 5 years of a bland and tasteless diet. And then she looked at Clara Dunham, and she spoke, her voice a low and raspy whisper, the first words she had spoken in what felt like a lifetime. "My name is Zariah Cole." She took another sip of the hot chocolate, the warmth spreading through her cold and exhausted body. And then she delivered the words that would be the beginning of a mystery that would haunt Clara Dunham for the rest of her career. The words that were a plea, a testament, and a prophecy. "Mama's still there." Zariah's quiet and chilling declaration sent a ripple of a strange and unfamiliar urgency through the Yazoo County Sheriff's Department. The case of the mud-caked and deeply traumatized little girl had suddenly transformed from a simple, if tragic, story of a lost child into something else, something more complex and more sinister. The words "Mama's still there" hung in the air of the station, a question mark that demanded an answer. Deputy Clara Dunham, her protective instincts now fully and irrevocably engaged, took charge. She pieced together what little information she could from Zariah's disjointed and deeply fragmented narrative. Zariah spoke of a community, of a leader named Samuel, of fields, and of a storm. She did not use the word cult or prison. her child's vocabulary not yet equipped with the language to properly define the true and horrifying nature of her experience. But the picture she painted, in her quiet and halting whispers, was one of isolation, of control, of a world that was cut off from the one that Clara knew. The location was the biggest challenge. Zariah's sense of geography was, understandably, non-existent. She could only describe the long, dusty road, the sunflowers, the collection of cabins. But Yazoo County was a vast and largely rural place, a patchwork of farms and forests and small and unincorporated communities. The search, Clara knew, would be like looking for a needle in a haystack, but Zariah had given them one, crucial, and ultimately, a deeply ironic clue. She had spoken of the purpose names, of how her mother had been renamed Pillar. It was a strange and seemingly insignificant detail, but to Clara it was a piece of a puzzle. She remembered, from a few years prior, a series of minor and ultimately dismissed complaints about a new and deeply private spiritual retreat that had been established in a remote and northern section of the county. The complaints had been vague, tales of strange chanting, of high fences, of a charismatic and deeply secretive leader. And she remembered one specific and deeply bizarre detail from one of the reports. The community, the complainant had alleged, referred to itself as the Pillars of the New Dawn. It was a long shot, a hunch based on a linguistic and deeply tenuous connection. But it was all they had. Clara, armed with a warrant to investigate a potential case of child endangerment, assembled a small team of deputies. They left the station in the late morning, the sky now a clear and brilliant blue, the world washed clean by the storm of the previous night. A stark and deeply ironic contrast to the dark and murky business they were about. The drive was long, taking them deep into a part of the county that was sparsely populated, a place of lonely, dirt roads and vast and silent fields. And then they saw it. A long, dusty driveway, lined with rows of sunflowers, their bright yellow heads now battered and drooping from the fury of the storm. A simple, hand-carved wooden sign lay on the ground, torn from its posts by the wind. It read, "The Haven." A cold and deeply unsettling feeling began to creep up Clara's spine. The place was silent, not peaceful, but empty. The air was thick with a sense of a profound and recent abandonment. As they pulled up to the main cluster of buildings, the silence became deafening. There were no voices, no sounds of work, no signs of life. The place was a ghost town. They began a methodical and increasingly and deeply and unnervingly fruitless search. The cabins were unlocked, their doors swinging gently in the breeze, and they were empty, not just of people, but of everything. The beds were stripped bare, the cupboards were empty, the floors were swept clean. There were no clothes, no books, no personal belongings of any kind. It was as if the people who had lived here had simply vanished, taking every last trace of their existence with them. The main hall was the same, the benches neatly arranged, the floor swept, the altar-like space where Reynard had preached now just a bare and silent platform. They found the archive of yesterday, the ornate wooden box where the residents had surrendered their identities, but it too was empty. Its velvet-lined interior holding nothing but the faint and musty smell of old paper. They searched the entire compound, every cabin, every outbuilding, every inch of the fields. They found nothing, no people, no bodies, no records, no clues. It was a perfect and chillingly efficient vanishing act. The community had been there less than 24 hours ago, and now it was gone. Its existence erased as completely and as thoroughly as the names of the people who had been its members. The official investigation was a short and deeply frustrating affair. With no evidence of a crime, no witnesses other than a traumatized 9-year-old girl, and no missing persons reports filed for any of the community's members, there was little for the department to go on. The prevailing, and deeply and infuriatingly convenient theory among Clara's superiors was that the community had simply decided to move on. They were a transient and deeply eccentric group, the argument went, and the storm had likely been the catalyst for their voluntary relocation. The case was closed within a matter of weeks. The final report, a thin and deeply inadequate testament to a mystery that had been dismissed before it had ever truly been investigated. Zariah Cole was placed into the state's foster care system, a ward of a system that did not know what to do with a girl whose past had been so completely and so utterly erased. And Clara Dunham, the young deputy who had been the first to see the truth in the girl's haunted and deeply intelligent eyes, was left with a deep and abiding sense of a profound and personal failure. She knew, with a certainty that would gnaw at her for the rest of her career, that this had not been a voluntary relocation. This had been an escape, and the quiet and seemingly empty fields of the Haven were not a testament to a community that had moved on, but to a crime that had been, for the moment, perfectly and successfully concealed. The years that followed Zariah's escape from the Haven were a long and lonely exercise in the art of survival. The foster care system, for all its good intentions, was a blunt and often clumsy instrument, ill-equipped to deal with the specific and deeply complex trauma of a child who had been raised in a world of such profound and systematic control. Zariah was a ghost, a girl without a past, her history a blank and unverifiable slate. She was moved from one well-meaning but ultimately baffled foster home to another, a quiet and solitary child who seemed to exist behind a thick and impenetrable wall of her own making. Her silence was often misinterpreted as defiance, her watchfulness as suspicion. She did not know how to play with other children, their loud and chaotic games a jarring and deeply unsettling contrast to the silent and regimented world she had known. She did not know how to form attachments, her trust in the adult world having been so completely and so brutally shattered. The love and affection of her foster parents, which was offered with a genuine and often frustrated sincerity, felt to her like another form of control, another set of rules she had to learn, another performance she had to master in order to survive. The therapists were the most difficult. They were kind, patient, and professionally trained to excavate the buried and painful artifacts of a troubled past. But they did not have a map for the landscape of Zariah's mind. They would ask her about her feelings, about her memories, but the words she had to describe her experience were inadequate, the language of the outside world too small to contain the vast and silent horror of what she had endured. How could she explain the feeling of watching her own mother disappear before her very eyes? How could she describe the particular and chilling quality of Samuel Reynard's smile? How could she make them understand the profound and soul-crushing weight of a world without a name? Her stories were often dismissed as the fantasies of a traumatized and deeply imaginative child. A community where everyone had new names, a leader who took their IDs, a place that had vanished overnight. It sounded like something from a dark and twisted fairy tale. Without any evidence, without any corroboration, her truth was just a story, and a story that was too strange, too unsettling, for most people to believe. And so, she learned to stop telling it. She learned that her past was a secret, a burden that she, and she alone, had to carry. Her only outlet, the only place where she could give voice to the silent and screaming memories that haunted her dreams, was in her art. She would draw for hours on end, her small and intense face bent over a piece of paper, her pencil moving with a fierce and focused concentration. But she did not draw the happy and brightly colored pictures of a normal childhood. She did not draw houses or trees or smiling stick-figure families. She drew fences. She drew endless and repeating patterns of tall and menacing sunflowers, their cheerful, yellow faces twisted into grotesque and mocking sneers. She drew watchtowers, their sharp and angular, lines cutting into a pale and empty sky. She drew rows of small and identical cabins, their windows dark and vacant, like the eyes of a skull. And in every picture, there was a single and recurring motif: a gate. Sometimes it was closed, a solid and impenetrable barrier, but more often than not, it was half open, a small and tantalizing sliver of a darkness that was both a memory of her escape and a symbol of the people she had left behind. Her drawings were a language, a complex and deeply personal hieroglyphic of her past. They were a map of her prison, a testament to the world that everyone else had forgotten or had chosen not to believe in. They were her way of remembering, of holding on to the truth in a world that seemed determined to deny it. Her foster parents and therapists would look at the drawings with a kind of worried and deeply uncomprehending pity, seeing them as just another symptom of her deep and seemingly intractable trauma. They did not understand that they were not just pictures. They were evidence. They were a promise. As she grew older, as the sharp and jagged edges of her trauma began to be worn smooth by the slow and persistent passage of time, a new and powerful force began to take root in her soul. The fear, which had been her constant companion for so long, began to recede, and in its place, something else began to grow. A cold, hard, and incredibly focused anger. It was not a hot and chaotic anger, but a quiet and patient and deeply, profoundly righteous one. It was the anger of a witness who had been silenced, of a victim who had been disbelieved. She began to excel in school, her mind, which had been honed by years of silent and meticulous observation, proving to be a sharp and powerful instrument. She devoured books, her hunger for knowledge, for information, for the tools to understand the world, insatiable. She was no longer just surviving. She was preparing. She was forging herself into a weapon of truth, of memory, of a justice that had been, for too long, denied. The girl who drew fences was learning how to tear them down, and she knew, with a certainty that was as clear and as sharp as the lines in her drawings, that one day she would go back, not to the place, but to the story, and this time she would be the one to tell it. The year was 2012. 16 years after Zariah Cole had stumbled out of a storm and into a world that had refused to believe her story. The quiet and deeply traumatized girl had grown into a calm and formidably intelligent woman of 25. The ghosts of her past had not disappeared, but she had learned to live with them, to transform their haunting and paralyzing whispers into a source of a quiet and unshakable strength. Her life was a testament to a resilience that was as deep, as profound, and as unyielding as the Mississippi soil from which she had sprung. She had put herself through college, her fierce and focused determination a source of awe to her professors and peers. She had chosen to study social work, a decision that was born not just of a desire to help others, but of a need to understand the systems that had so profoundly and so completely failed her. She had learned the language of bureaucracy, of institutions, of the complex and often indifferent machinery of the state. She had learned how people could fall through the cracks, how stories could be lost, how inconvenient and difficult truths could be buried under the weight of paperwork and official indifference. She was not just learning to navigate the system, she was learning how to dismantle it. And all the while, she was conducting her own secret and deeply personal investigation. The case of the Haven, which had been relegated to a single, thin and dust-covered file in the archives of the Yazoo County Sheriff's Department, was, for her, a living, breathing, and deeply, profoundly unfinished story. She had never stopped looking for answers. She had never stopped searching for the man who had stolen her childhood, and her mother. Her investigation began not with witness interviews or crime scene analysis, but in the quiet and musty confines of public archives and the bright and infinite digital expanse of the Internet. She had one, single, and seemingly insignificant piece of information to start with: the name of the man who had found her on the side of the road, the truck driver, Henderson. It had taken her months of painstaking work, of sifting through old and poorly digitized police reports, but she had finally found his full name and his trucking company. She had tracked him down, a kind and aging man who was now retired and who had never forgotten the image of the small and mud-caked girl he had found on the side of the road on that stormy and long ago morning. He had been able to pinpoint the exact location where he had found her, a small and forgotten stretch of highway in the most remote and northern part of Yazoo County. With a location, she now had a starting point. She spent her weekends driving the lonely back roads of the county, her old and reliable sedan kicking up clouds of dust as she searched for the place that had been her prison. And one day, she found it. The sunflowers were long gone, the land now overgrown with weeds and thorny and impenetrable brush. But the cabins were still there, their roofs sagging, their windows dark and empty, their wood weathered to a pale and ghostly gray. The main hall stood like a monument to a forgotten civilization, its circular frame a stark and skeletal reminder of the world that had been. Standing there, in the silence of the place that had been the site of her greatest trauma, she felt not fear, but a cold and clarifying sense of a profound and righteous purpose. This was not a graveyard of her past. This was a crime scene, and she was the lead and only investigator. She began to dig into the land records, spending hours in the dusty and poorly organized basement of the county courthouse. She traced the ownership of the property, and what she found was the first and most significant breakthrough in her long and lonely search. The land had been purchased not by Samuel Reynard, but by a non-profit organization called the New Dawn Foundation, an organization with a vague and deeply anodyne mission statement about spiritual wellness and agricultural sustainability. This was the thread. She pulled on it, and the entire and carefully constructed tapestry of Samuel Reynard's hidden world began to unravel. Using online databases and public records requests, she discovered that the New Dawn Foundation was just one of a dozen similar non-profits, all registered in different states, all with different and equally vague mission statements, but all connected by a web of interlocking board members and a single and recurring mailing address, a P.O. box in a small and unremarkable town in southern Florida. She had found his network. The Haven was not a one-time and isolated experiment. It was a franchise. Samuel Reynard was not just a charismatic and deeply manipulative leader. He was a predator who had turned the spiritual and emotional vulnerability of desperate people into a business model. He would set up a community, draw in followers, exploit their labor, and control their lives. And then, when he felt the risk of exposure was too great, he would vanish, liquidating the assets of one nonprofit and using the funds to create another, a new sanctuary in a new and unsuspecting location. She had found his method. She had found his pattern. But she had not yet found him. The names on the corporate filings were all aliases, the mailing address a dead end. He was a ghost, a master of erasure, a man who had built a career on the art of disappearing. But he had made one, and ultimately, a deeply fatal mistake. He had let one small and incredibly observant girl escape, and that girl had never, for one single solitary moment, forgotten his face. Zariah now had a map of his world, a blueprint of his design. The hunt was on. Zariah knew that her investigation, as thorough and as damning as it was, had hit a wall. She had the corporate structure, the pattern, the blueprint of Samuel Reynard's predatory enterprise. But what she lacked was the one thing she needed to turn her private and deeply personal crusade into a public and official case: credibility. She was a survivor, a victim, and she knew that, in the cold and skeptical eyes of the law, her story would always be tainted by the perceived and deeply unfair bias of her own personal trauma. She needed an ally, someone from within the system that had so profoundly failed her, someone whose voice would be heard and respected, where hers would not. She needed Clara Dunham. Finding the retired sheriff was not difficult. Clara had left the force a few years after the case of the Haven had gone cold, her disillusionment with the job and with herself having become too heavy a burden to carry. She now lived a quiet and solitary life in a small and unassuming house on the outskirts of Jackson. Her days spent gardening, her nights spent with the ghosts of the cases she had never been able to solve. The ghost of the small and mud-caked girl in the sheriff's station was the one that haunted her the most. When Zariah knocked on her door, Clara did not, at first, recognize the tall and strikingly composed young woman who stood on her porch. But then, she looked into her eyes, and in their dark and unnervingly intelligent depths, she saw the same and unforgettable look of a fierce and unwavering determination that she had seen in the eyes of the 9-year-old girl all those years ago. The meeting was tense, the air in Clara's small and meticulously neat living room thick with the weight of 16 years of unspoken and deeply unresolved history. Zariah did not accuse. She did not recriminate. She simply and methodically laid out her case. She spread her files out on the coffee table, the land deeds, the corporate filings, the maps of the shell companies. She spoke with a calm and dispassionate clarity, her voice never wavering, her presentation as professional and as compelling as any that Clara had ever seen from a seasoned and highly paid prosecutor. For Clara, listening to Zariah's story was an act of pure and unadulterated penance. Every word was a fresh and deeply painful twist of the knife of her own long-buried guilt. She saw, with a horrifying and deeply shaming clarity, the full and devastating extent of her own and her department's failure. The clues had been there, the pattern had been discernible, but they had not looked, they had not listened. They had chosen the easy and convenient path of dismissal, and in doing so, they had allowed a monster to continue his work, unchecked and unhindered. When Zariah had finished, Clara was silent for a long and heavy moment. And then she spoke, her voice thick with an emotion that was equal parts shame and a new and deeply powerful sense of a long overdue and deeply righteous purpose. "What do you need from me?" she asked. It was the beginning of an unlikely and deeply formidable alliance. Clara's guilt became a powerful and motivating fuel. She still had her contacts, her knowledge of procedure, her understanding of the complex and often frustrating language of the law. She began to work her old channels, calling in favors, pushing for the case to be reopened. Her voice, that of a respected, if retired, member of the law enforcement community, carrying a weight that Zariah's never could. Together, they began to search for other survivors. They knew that Zariah could not have been the only one, that in a network as large and as long-running as Reynard's, there had to be others who had escaped, others who had stories to tell. Their search led them to a name from Zariah's own and secret notebook, the name of a young woman who had disappeared from the Haven a few months before Zariah's own escape. Her name was Renee Watkins. They found her living under an assumed name in a small and anonymous apartment complex in Nashville. She was a woman who was haunted, her life a fortress of paranoia and a deep and abiding distrust of the world. It took weeks for Clara and Zariah to earn her trust, to convince her that they were not a threat, that they were not connected to the people she was so terrified of. And then, one day, she let them in, and she showed them her secret. In a locked and fireproof box that she kept hidden under her floorboards, she had her own, and even more meticulous, archive. For years, she had been keeping logs, a detailed and deeply damning record of every family she had seen come and go from the Haven and from another, similar, community in rural Tennessee that Reynard had run before it. She had names, dates, and places. She had a list of the aliases that Reynard and his inner circle had used. She was not just a witness, she was a historian. The three women sat together in the small and cluttered apartment. Their three and very different stories weaving together to form a single and undeniable narrative of a profound and long-hidden crime. The victim, the failed law officer, and the forgotten witness. They were a small and seemingly powerless army, but they had the truth, and they had each other. The fortress of silence that Samuel Reynard had so carefully and so brutally constructed around his world was about to be breached. The discovery of Renee Watkins and her meticulous logs was the spark that turned the cold case of the Haven into a wildfire. But Zariah and Clara knew that official channels, even with Clara's renewed and deeply motivated involvement, would be slow and bureaucratic and deeply and frustratingly inadequate. Reynard's network was international, his crimes a complex and tangled web of financial fraud and psychological coercion, a type of crime that the traditional and often blunt instruments of law enforcement were ill-equipped to prosecute. They needed to do more than just reopen a case. They needed to start a movement. They needed to take their story directly to the one and only court that mattered, the court of public opinion. It was at this point that a new and crucial ally entered the fight. Darius Coleman was Zariah's cousin, one of the few and precious family connections that she had managed to forge in the years after her escape. He was a young, ambitious, and deeply talented journalist, working for a small and independent online news outlet that specialized in long-form investigative documentary work. He had grown up hearing the whispers of his family's strange and tragic story. The tale of the aunt who had disappeared and the young cousin who had returned from the wilderness with a story that no one could quite comprehend. He had always believed Zariah, and he had been waiting, for years, for the moment when he could help her tell her story to the world. The project was born out of a deep and shared sense of a profound and righteous purpose. Working out of Darius's small and cluttered apartment, which they turned into a makeshift production studio, the four of them, Zariah, Clara, Renee, and Darius, began to assemble the pieces of their narrative. Darius was a gifted and deeply empathetic interviewer, his calm and patient demeanor allowing Zariah and Renee to tell their stories in their own words, in their own time. He did not sensationalize. He did not embellish. He simply and powerfully bore witness. The documentary, which they titled The Children of the Haven, was not a traditional true crime story. It was a quiet and deeply devastating portrait of the human cost of coercive control. Darius made the brilliant and deeply effective creative decision to build the visual narrative around Zariah's childhood drawings. The sketches, which had once been the silent and solitary expression of a child's deep and unspeakable trauma, were now transformed into powerful and deeply compelling pieces of evidence. He animated them, bringing the dark and menacing world of the Haven to life. The fences of sunflowers, the watchful and silent towers, the half-open gate, all rendered in the stark and chillingly innocent lines of a child's hand. Clara provided the official and deeply and damningly authoritative context. Her on-camera interview a sober and deeply regretful account of the systemic failures that had allowed Reynard's operation to flourish, unchecked and unhindered. She spoke of the biases, of the lack of resources, of the institutional and deeply ingrained tendency to dismiss the stories of women, particularly women of color. Her confession of her own and her department's failure was a powerful and deeply courageous act of public accountability. Renee, her face obscured to protect her identity, provided the final and most crucial pieces of the puzzle. Her calm and steady voice reading from the names and dates in her hidden logs, a somber and deeply moving litany of the forgotten. The documentary was short, just under 20 minutes, a tight and powerful and utterly and completely devastating piece of investigative journalism. They did not have the backing of a major network or a large and well-funded production company. They had only the truth and a deep and unwavering belief in the power of their story. Darius uploaded the film to the internet, and they waited, their hearts a mixture of hope and a deep and very real fear. The response was not immediate, but it was profound. At first, it was a slow and steady trickle of views, a few hundred, then a few thousand. But then, the story began to catch fire. It was shared on social media, picked up by bloggers, and then by larger and more mainstream news outlets. The quiet and deeply personal story of the Haven had become a national conversation. People were horrified. They were outraged, and they were activated. The comments section of the video became a digital and deeply supportive community, a space where people shared their own, similar stories of control and of survival. The documentary had done more than just tell a story. It had given a voice to the voiceless. It had shown a bright and unforgiving light into one of the darkest and most hidden corners of society. The world was finally and irrevocably listening, and for Samuel Reynard, a man who had built his empire in the shadows, whose power depended on the silence and the disbelief of the outside world, this new and deeply unwelcome spotlight was the beginning of the end. He had been a ghost for a very, very long time, but now, thanks to the courage of the children he had tried to erase, he was about to become visible. The viral success of the Children of the Haven transformed the cold case from a private obsession into a public cause. The floodgates of information, which had been sealed shut for 16 years, burst open. Darius's email inbox, which he had set up as a tip line at the end of the documentary, was inundated with messages from across the country and around the world. The messages were a heartbreaking and deeply powerful tapestry of loss and of a fragile and long-dormant hope. They came from the families of the people on Renee's lists, people who had spent years searching for their lost loved ones, their pleas for help ignored, their stories dismissed by law enforcement agencies that had labeled their missing relatives as runaways or as casualties of their own, irresponsible life choices. For the first time, these families were not alone. They had found each other, and they had found a community that believed them. The tips poured in, a torrent of names and dates and locations of other, similar, wellness communities, other spiritual retreats that had appeared and then vanished, without a trace. A pattern began to emerge, a map of Samuel Reynard's movements across the country, a trail of broken lives and unanswered questions that stretched from the swamps of Florida to the deserts of Arizona. Zariah, Clara, and Renee worked tirelessly, sifting through the information, cross-referencing the names and dates, building a case that was growing stronger and more damning with every passing day. They were no longer just a small and unlikely alliance. They were the nerve center of a nationwide and crowdsourced investigation, but the one crucial piece of the puzzle was still missing. They had his network, his methods, his history, but they did not have him. He was still a ghost, his current whereabouts a complete and deeply frustrating mystery. They knew he would have seen the documentary. They knew he would be on the move, that he would be erasing his tracks, that he would be creating a new identity, a new life, in a new and unsuspecting corner of the world. The fear that he would slip through their fingers, that he would vanish once again, was a constant and deeply gnawing presence. And then the email arrived. It was from a woman who had just returned from a vacation in Belize. She had been staying at a lavish and exclusive, holistic wellness resort, a paradise for the wealthy, and spiritually adrift on the country's beautiful and sun-drenched coast. She had seen the documentary, and a face from her vacation, a man who was a life coach at the resort, had struck her as hauntingly and chillingly familiar. She had attached a photograph, a casual and brightly lit snapshot taken on her phone. Zariah opened the attachment, her heart a frantic and hammering drum in her chest. And there he was. He was older, his hair now a distinguished and completely white, silver. He was thinner, his face tanned and lined from years in the tropical Sunday. He was wearing expensive, white linen clothes and a smile that was the very picture of serene and benevolent wisdom. He was calling himself Samuel R., a thin and almost laughably arrogant attempt at an alias. But it was him. The eyes were the same, those pale and piercingly blue eyes, still as cold and as dead as a snake's. The predator had not changed his methods. He had simply changed his hunting ground, trading the desperate and the vulnerable for the wealthy and the bored. A wave of a complex and overwhelming emotion washed over Zariah. There was the hot and bitter taste of a familiar and deeply primal fear, the instinctive and physical reaction of a prey animal that has once again caught the scent of its hunter. But beneath the fear, there was something else, something more powerful. The cold and deeply satisfying feeling of a profound and long-awaited vindication. She had found him. The ghost had a face. The monster had a name and a location. The verification process was swift and deeply and satisfyingly professional. Clara, using her old and now deeply and enthusiastically reactivated law enforcement contacts, forwarded the photograph and the location to the FBI. The Bureau's facial recognition software confirmed the match in a matter of hours. Samuel Reynard, who had an outstanding, if long dormant, warrant for a minor parole violation from a decades-old assault charge, was now a person of official and deeply serious interest. The wheels of a justice that had been stalled for so long finally and irrevocably began to turn. The U.S. authorities, armed with the evidence from the documentary and the testimony of the dozens of new witnesses who had come forward, began the formal and diplomatic process of requesting the cooperation of the Belizean government for his extradition. The hunt was no longer a secret and deeply personal crusade. It was now an international and official manhunt. For Zariah, the moment was not one of triumphant and celebratory joy. It was a moment of quiet and sober resolve. This was not the end. This was the beginning of the end. The man who had haunted her dreams for 16 years was about to be made real, to be brought from the shadows and into the harsh and unforgiving light of a courtroom. The face in the crowd had been found, and he was about to be held accountable, not just for the crimes he had committed against her, but for the legion of other and long-forgotten children of the haven whose faces she had so carefully and so lovingly preserved in the pages of her secret and now sacred notebook. The final act of Samuel Reynard's long and sordid career of manipulation and control was not a dramatic and violent confrontation, but a quiet and almost laughably mundane bureaucratic procedure. There was no high-speed chase, no armed standoff. He was detained, without incident, by the local Belizean authorities while he was conducting a sunrise yoga session on the beach for a group of wealthy and completely unsuspecting tourists. The man who had built an empire on the illusion of his own godlike power was, in the end, just a man, a tired and aging con artist whose time had finally and irrevocably run out. The extradition process was swift, the Belizean government eager to rid itself of the stain of harboring an international fugitive. When he was brought back to the United States, his hands cuffed, his face a pale and drawn mask of a disbelief that had not yet curdled into fear, he was no longer the charismatic and all-powerful leader of the haven. He was just a defendant, a name on a docket, a problem for the criminal justice system to solve. The case against him was a mountain of evidence, a testament to the tireless and deeply collaborative work of the small and unlikely army that had brought him down. The viral documentary, the meticulous logs of Renee Watkins, the damning financial records unearthed by Zariah, and the heartbreaking and deeply compelling testimony of the dozens of other survivors and family members who had come forward, all combined to paint a picture of a predator whose crimes were as extensive, as systematic, and as profoundly and soul-crushingly evil as any that the seasoned and deeply cynical prosecutors had ever seen. The charges were numerous, and they were severe: financial coercion, identity fraud, unlawful confinement, and, most chillingly, a series of charges related to the discovery of unregistered burial sites on the grounds of the Old Haven property. The forensic investigation of the compound, which had been prompted by the renewed and now deeply and publicly scrutinized investigation, had unearthed the final and most tragic secret of the Haven. They found the remains of several adults, people who had been listed in Renee's logs as having completed their journey. The official cause of death was, in most cases, determined to be malnutrition or untreated and easily preventable medical conditions, a testament to the brutal and deadly consequences of Reynard's systematic and deeply cruel neglect. He had not just stolen their lives, he had, through his deliberate and calculated inaction, ended them. The trial was a sober and deeply methodical affair. The prosecution, led by a sharp and tenacious assistant district attorney, laid out the case with a calm and devastating precision. They detailed the financial crimes, showing how Reynard had funneled millions of dollars in donations from his followers and their families into a series of offshore accounts, using the money to fund his own lavish and deeply hypocritical lifestyle. They detailed the psychological crimes, with expert witnesses explaining the insidious and powerful techniques of coercive control, of indoctrination, of the systematic and deliberate dismantling of the human will. But the most powerful and most unforgettable moments of the trial came from the testimony of the survivors. One by one, they took the stand, their voices, at first trembling, and then growing stronger and more confident, as they finally and publicly spoke their truth. They spoke of their lost families, of their stolen years, of the deep and lasting scars of their experience. And then it was Zariah's turn. She walked to the witness stand, her posture erect, her gaze fixed and unwavering on the man who sat at the defendant's table. She did not look at him with hatred or with fear. She looked at him with a kind of cold and clinical detachment, the look of a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. She spoke, her voice clear and steady, and devoid of any emotion other than a deep and unshakable certainty. She told her story, from the day she had arrived at the Haven as a hopeful and deeply innocent 5-year-old, to the day she had escaped as a determined and deeply, profoundly old 9-year-old. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She simply and powerfully presented the facts. Her testimony was the final and most devastating blow. Samuel Reynard was found guilty on all charges. The judge, his face a grim and deeply weary mask, sentenced him to multiple consecutive life terms, ensuring that the man who had built a career on the art of disappearing would now spend the rest of his own and pathetic life in a place from which there was no escape. For Zariah, the verdict was not a moment of celebration. It was a moment of a quiet and deeply profound closure. Justice, which had been so long delayed, had finally and irrevocably been served. The story was over. But the work of healing, for her, and for the countless other children of the Haven, was just beginning. In the years that followed the trial, the name Zariah Cole became synonymous not with victimhood, but with a quiet and formidable strength. The young woman who had brought down a monster and his hidden empire could have retreated from the spotlight, her own, and deeply personal, justice now served. She could have chosen a life of peace and of a well-deserved and hard-won anonymity. But Zariah had not fought so hard and for so long just to save herself. Her mission had always been larger, a purpose that had been forged in the silent and watchful darkness of her childhood. She used the platform that her story had given her, not for personal gain but for the collective good. She established the Cole Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting the survivors of coercive communities and high-control groups. The foundation was her answer to the silence, her rebuttal to the world's disbelief. It was a place of refuge, of resources, of a deep and unwavering community for those who, like her, had been lost in the shadows, their stories unheard, their pain unseen. It offered legal aid, mental health services, and, most importantly, a space where survivors could connect with each other, where they could learn that they were not alone, that their experiences were real, and that healing was possible. The launch event for the foundation was held on a bright and hopeful spring afternoon in Jackson. The crowd was a diverse and deeply moving tapestry of faces: survivors, family members, journalists, social workers, and law enforcement officials. In the audience, watching with a deep and paternal pride, was her cousin, Darius Coleman, his documentary now a staple in university sociology courses, a testament to the power of journalism to effect real and lasting change. And beside him sat Clara Dunham, her silver hair shining in the afternoon sun, her face, which had once been etched with the deep and painful lines of guilt, now a portrait of a serene and deeply satisfying redemption. When Zariah stepped to the podium, she was greeted with a long and heartfelt standing ovation. She stood there for a moment, a calm and composed figure in the eye of a storm of a pure and grateful emotion. And then she spoke, her voice clear and steady, and full of a wisdom that belied her years. She did not speak of her own personal trauma. She spoke of the universal and deeply human need for belonging, and of how that need can be twisted and exploited by those who seek to control. She spoke of the power of memory, of the sacred and deeply necessary act of bearing witness. And she spoke of hope, of the incredible and deeply and profoundly resilient power of the human spirit to heal, to rebuild, and to create a new and better future. Later that day, there was a private and more intimate ceremony. On a small and quiet plot of land on the outskirts of the city, a memorial garden had been created. It was a place of peace, of remembrance, for the people of the haven who had not survived, for the names in Zariah's notebook whose stories had ended in the dark and silent earth of the compound. For each missing name, a magnolia tree was planted, their broad and glossy leaves a symbol of a deep and abiding southern resilience, their large and fragrant white blossoms a promise of a beauty and a life that can emerge from even the darkest and most painful of soils. As the sun began to set, casting a warm and golden glow over the newly planted trees, Darius filmed the closing moment. Zariah stood alone in the garden, the gentle evening breeze rustling the leaves of the trees that bore the names of her lost friends. In her hands, she held her old childhood notebook, its pages filled with the sketches and the names that had been the first and most important thread in the long and difficult tapestry of justice she had woven. She looked up, her face turned toward the light, a small and almost imperceptible smile on her lips. She was no longer a ghost, haunted by the past. She was a founder, building a future. Her final narration, the words that would close the final chapter of her long and incredible journey, echoed in the quiet and hopeful air of the garden. She escaped once for herself and once more for everyone still waiting to be found. Thank you for watching.